Welcome to History with Herodotus, where the boundaries of time and space converge to reveal the intricate tapestry of human experience. Today, we embark on a fascinating journey to explore one of the most pivotal conflicts of the early 20th century, the Russo-Japanese War. This war, fought between the Russian Empire and the Empire of Japan from 1904 to 1905, was a clash of titans that would reshape the global balance of power and leave an indelible mark on the course of modern history. In the late 19th century, the Russian Empire, under the rule of Tsar Nicholas II, was expanding its influence in East Asia, driven by a desire to establish itself as a major power in the region. The Russians had long been interested in gaining access to warm water ports and securing a foothold on the Asian continent. Their sights were set on Manchuria, a vast and fertile region in northeastern China, which offered unparalleled economic and strategic opportunities. Meanwhile, the Empire of Japan, having undergone a remarkable transformation since the Meiji Restoration of 1868, was emerging as a major player on the world stage. The Japanese had modernized their military, adopted Western technologies, and were eager to assert their dominance in East Asia. They had already demonstrated their prowess in the First Sino-Japanese War, defeating China and gaining control of Taiwan and the Pescadores Islands. As Russian influence in Manchuria grew, so did Japanese concerns about their own security and access to the region's rich resources. The Japanese were particularly alarmed by the construction of the Trans-Siberian Railway, which would enable Russia to rapidly deploy troops to the Far East and potentially threaten Japan's interests. In 1902, Japan formed an alliance with Britain, which provided a measure of security against potential Russian aggression. The following year, in 1903, Russia and Japan engaged in a series of tense negotiations over their competing claims in Manchuria and Korea. The Russians, confident in their military superiority, were unwilling to make significant concessions, while the Japanese, determined to protect their interests, refused to back down. As the diplomatic efforts faltered, both sides began to prepare for war. In January 1904, Japan's foreign minister, Komura Jotaro, delivered an ultimatum to the Russian government, demanding that they withdraw their troops from Manchuria and recognize Japanese control over Korea. The Russians, dismissing the Japanese demands as impertinent, failed to respond. And on February 8, 1904, Japan launched a surprise attack on the Russian naval base at Port Arthur, located on the tip of the Liaodong Peninsula in southern Manchuria. As the Japanese attack on Port Arthur commenced on February 8, 1904, the Russian naval base was caught off guard, with many of its ships still anchored in the harbor. The Japanese fleet, under the command of Admiral Heihachiro Togo, launched a series of daring torpedo boat attacks, striking several Russian vessels and inflicting significant damage. The Russians, however, were able to respond quickly, and a fierce naval battle ensued, with both sides exchanging gunfire and suffering heavy losses. The Japanese strategy, masterminded by Admiral Togo, was to whittle down the Russian fleet through a series of hit-and-run attacks, exploiting the element of surprise and the superior speed and maneuverability of their ships. This approach allowed them to neutralize the Russian naval presence in the region, paving the way for a full-scale invasion of Manchuria. On February 9, 1904, Japanese forces landed at Kamalpo, near modern-day Incheon, Korea, and began to march towards Seoul with the aim of securing key transportation hubs and disrupting Russian supply lines. As the war raged on, the Russians found themselves facing a series of unexpected challenges. Their military leaders had underestimated the strength and determination of the Japanese army, which was better trained, better equipped, and more mobile than they had anticipated. The Russian commander, General Alexei Kuropatkin, struggled to respond effectively to the Japanese advances, hampered by inadequate intelligence, poor logistics, and a lack of coordination between his forces. One of the most significant battles of the war took place on April 30, 1904, when Japanese forces clashed with the Russians at the Yalu River, which marked the border between Manchuria and Korea. The Japanese army, led by General Tamemoto Kuroki, launched a bold assault across the river, using pontoon bridges and clever tactics to outflank the Russian defenses. After a fierce and bloody battle, the Russians were forced to retreat, leaving behind many dead and wounded soldiers. The Battle of the Yalu River was a turning point in the war, as it marked the first major land victory for the Japanese and demonstrated their ability to defeat the Russians in a conventional battle. The Russian defeat also had significant implications for the global balance of power, as it showed that a non-European nation could challenge and defeat one of the great powers of Europe. As the summer of 1904 wore on, the war continued to escalate, with both sides suffering heavy losses. The Japanese army pushed deep into Manchuria, capturing key cities such as Mukden and Liaoyang, while the Russian Navy struggled to regain its footing after the loss of Port Arthur. On August 10, 1904, the Japanese launched a massive assault on the Russian naval base at Vladivostok, but were repelled with heavy losses. Despite these setbacks, the Japanese remained determined to achieve their strategic objectives, which included the capture of the strategic port city of Dalny, located near modern-day Dalian. On August 24, 1904, Japanese forces launched a fierce assault on the Russian defenses at Liaoyang, using clever tactics and exploiting weaknesses in the Russian lines. After several days of intense fighting, the Russians were forced to retreat, leaving behind many dead and wounded soldiers. As the war dragged on into the autumn of 1904, both sides began to feel the strain of prolonged conflict. The Japanese army was exhausted from months of continuous fighting, while the Russians were struggling to maintain their supply lines and replace their heavy losses. On October 20, 1904, the Russian Baltic Fleet, which had been dispatched to reinforce the Russian naval presence in the Far East, set sail from the port city of Libau, marking a significant escalation of the conflict. As the Russian Baltic Fleet set sail from Libau, the Japanese Navy was well aware of its impending arrival and prepared to intercept it. On May 27, 1905, the two fleets clashed in the Tsushima Strait, located between Japan and Korea, in what would become one of the most decisive naval battles in history. The Japanese fleet, led by Admiral Heihachiru Togo, employed a clever tactic known as crossing the T, where they positioned their ships perpendicular to the Russian line, allowing them to unleash a withering broadside that devastated the Russian vessels. The Battle of Tsushima was a crushing defeat for the Russians, with over 20 ships sunk or captured, and more than 3,000 sailors killed or wounded. The catastrophic loss at Tsushima marked the beginning of the end of the war for Russia. On August 10, 1905, the two nations signed the Treaty of Portsmouth, negotiated by U.S. President Theodore Roosevelt, which officially ended the conflict. The treaty recognized Japan's control over Korea and ceded several territories to Japan, including the southern half of Sakhalin Island and the Liaodong Peninsula. Russia also agreed to withdraw its troops from Manchuria and recognize Japan's interests in the region. The Russo-Japanese War had far-reaching consequences, both for the nations involved and for the global balance of power. As the Japanese statesman Ito Hirobumi once said, "The war with Russia was a great turning point in our history. It marked the emergence of Japan as a major world power." The war demonstrated that a non-European nation could challenge and defeat one of the great powers of Europe, sending shockwaves throughout the international community. The war also marked the beginning of Japan's rise as a major military power, which would have significant implications for the region and the world in the decades to come. In the years following the war, Japan continued to expand its empire, annexing Korea in 1910 and eventually invading Manchuria in 1931. The legacy of the Russo-Japanese War can be seen in the complex web of alliances and rivalries that developed in East Asia during the 20th century, ultimately contributing to the outbreak of World War II. Today, the war is remembered as a pivotal moment in modern Japanese history, with many regarding it as a symbol of national pride and a testament to the country's determination and resilience. That's all for today's History with Herodotus. Remember to like, share, and subscribe. And until next time, remember that, to understand the present, we must first understand the past.